I know everyone's expecting a real college party story in here somewhere, so let's talk about how me and 3 other people crashed a USC frat party and how I got home afterwards. Now, I know a lot of people don't like to talk about their college days in too much detail, especially publicly, but because I don't drink, I actually remember what happened, and I think it's worth talking about. I had lots of opportunities to network and make friends with people while I was in college, and that was how, on January 12th, a filmmaker ended up inviting me to a frat party at USC. That fraternity will remain nameless, but, fun fact, on average, drunk, high, or otherwise intoxicated drivers kill around 34 people per day in the United States. And I was lucky that night didn't end in our deaths, or the DUI arrest of the driver. It was the least safe driving situation I'd ever been in, even worse than the one I talked about in Season 3, Episode 15. I don't want to glorify this lifestyle, but I think I should address what happened and what I learned from it. Because a lot of people do things they regret in college, but if we never talk about them, no one can learn from them. And I feel like it would be a lot to admit to never talk about the fact that I went to parties in college. So let's get into this. I woke up that morning and put on a red shirt, and that'll be important later on. That evening, I met up with a wealthy filmmaker, an older Whittier student that we'll call R, and 2 of his friends, Mac D and Thornberry, who you might remember I met during Season 3, Episode 5. They'd invited me to join them on this adventure, an escape from daily life, this fraternity party at USC, and that sounded like fun, sounded like an experience at the very least, way to take my mind off of anything negative, and I wanted to work with this filmmaker, so I agreed. Around 10 p.m. that night, R drove us to USC. And as soon as we got on the highway, I realized that I was in for a crazy night. They started hotboxing the car with joints and blunts that Mac D seemed to be rolling constantly. Now, I'll admit it. As a freshman in college, I had smoked weed before this, but only once. So my tolerance for marijuana was worse than 3 beers' tolerance for alcohol. I was shocked to see this smoke circle happen while we were driving, and the windows were up, so it didn't even matter if I didn't smoke. Everyone in that car was getting high. So when they passed me the joints, I took tiny little puffs compared to their large hits, but I was lit in a matter of seconds. Then, things got way crazier. Mac D pulled out some pills, which he said were ecstasy. Thornberry and Mac D did what was called parachuting ecstasy by crushing it up, wrapping it in a small piece of rolling paper, and then swallowing it whole. This made it like a ticking time bomb. Whenever their stomach acid managed to break through the paper, the drug was already crushed up and it would hit their system very quickly. That's dangerous for a whole bunch of other reasons, but the main one being a lot of pills are designed so that they release in a certain time frame. But if you crush them up trying to get a quicker or stronger high, it's a lot easier to overdose, depending on what the drug is. Now, that I didn't partake in. That felt way too extreme for me. Plus, I didn't like pills of any kind after seeing what they'd done to my mom, so I stuck to just smoking a little weed. They'd hotboxed the car so heavily that obviously we were all pretty lit by the time we made it to the address. Now, we did make it there without incident, barely, but even if a sober driver had gotten distracted and accidentally hit us, the police still would have arrested our driver and he would have gotten a DUI. But once we got to the frat house, I thought we'd be able to just walk in. But it turned out we actually crashed the party because they knew one guy who was a part of the fraternity and he snuck us in the back door and we were able to get in that way. But we made it. And I was pretty shocked when I saw the inside. I was impressed by the scope and size of this party. I'd never been to anything like this at Whittier. They had a multi-story building, and on the ground floor they had 12 beer pong tables lined up with a bartender at each one, and that was their bar. It seemed like this party was somehow sponsored by Red Bull because they had Red Bull logos, a Red Bull vending machine, and different hats and merchandise all over the place too. There was a dance floor area in another room with a DJ and tables that people were standing on and dancing on. And I danced around for a while, but didn't dance with anyone in particular because I was still dating Selena. But we partied hard for hours. I hadn't taken ecstasy, I hadn't had any alcohol, so I was definitely the most sober person in my group, and perhaps the most sober person at the party overall, but I was definitely still feeling the effects of the THC. Then, MacD disappeared, and at first we figured he was just talking to people somewhere else. But about an hour later, we started to get worried about him, so we started to search the house to see if we could find him. We found him on a staircase making out with a woman. When they finally broke apart, we realized that this girl was about twice his size and had the longest nose we'd ever seen in person. Intoxicated as we were, Thornberry had the jokes lined up like a modern-day Cyrano de Bergerac, saying things like, "I'm surprised he didn't get impaled on that thing. Put her on a horse and she could joust with it. I've never looked at a nose and gotten penis envy before." MacD retorted, "What do you mean? She was beautiful." Eventually, we got tired of the jokes and tired in general, and sometime after midnight, we gathered our group together to leave. Luckily, we were smart enough to know we needed to stay somewhere within walking distance, since there was no way anyone was driving. And R had the idea to stay at his sister's apartment, since she went to USC at the time and was living near campus. We walked from Frat Row to her apartment building because it wasn't too far away, and R had a key to her apartment, but she was asleep, and her phone must have been on silent because he couldn't get through. And we knew security wouldn't let us in without student IDs. So we improvised. We were able to walk in the front entrance, but then we saw there was a security guard at a desk in the room with the elevators, but one elevator door was open. R dropped down to the floor by the entrance and crawled past the guard's desk and into the elevator. I felt like I'd just been dropped into a spy movie while entirely unprepared and still high as shit. But I crawled over next, managing to stay silent, and turned around to see Thornberry army crawling quickly, looking super serious. And I had to suppress a laugh. MacD took his time, sliding on the floor a little because I think he was the most drunk out of the group. And I don't know how the guard didn't notice us. But R put a hand up and pressed the closed door button once we were all on the floor of the elevator, and when the doors closed, we let out a sigh of relief and stood up. But knew that we still had to make it into her living room before anyone came up to see why the elevator had moved seemingly on its own. As soon as the doors opened, we looked both directions and sprinted after R, who unlocked a door and he put a finger to his lips as we entered. We staked claims to the couch, chairs, and prime floor space, and around 3 a.m. passed out almost immediately. I fell asleep on a chair, and R's sister had no idea her living room was filled with party animals. I woke up 3 hours later. For some reason, we were all up at 6 a.m., and MacD looked up the woman he'd been making out with on Instagram. He let out a groan and said, "Oh no, that was who I was making out with? Why didn't anyone say something? Why didn't one of you stop me?" Fun fact, when someone is high on a mixture of weed and ecstasy while drunk, people can look very different from how they look when you're sober. "I need to smoke," MacD said, and decided to hotbox the living room. He rolled a very fat blunt and a joint, handing some nugs to me to break up into smaller pieces, and then we closed all the windows and started a quick smoke circle that had us coughing quietly as MacD lit everything to be in rotation all at once. I was still shocked by the amount of weed they were smoking, and this was my first time experiencing a wake and bake, as it's called. As we finished up, someone had the idea, what if we just left it like this? So that R's sister would wake up to a heavily hotboxed living room without any knowledge that anyone had been there at all. MacD told me to hold on to the gram or so of weed he'd given me to break up, and we left the room thick with weed haze without ever telling her we'd been there. And then, to my shock, MacD pulled out another joint that he lit up as we walked around the streets. And I saw the outside of the Robert Zemeckis Center for Digital Arts without knowing what it was at the time, but I would go on to work on a project there years later. Then around 7 a.m., R had to go to the airport to say goodbye to his parents. For some reason, we smoked again in the car on the way there, and Thornberry and MacD crushed up more ecstasy, and this time snorted lines of it off of R's laptop, and talked about going to the beach after that. I decided that this drug use was getting way too intense for me, And so as we approached LAX, I said I was getting hungry and was ready to go home. For some reason, we went with R to say goodbye to his parents and introduced ourselves while still high as shit. That was probably one of the most awkward interactions of my life. Just walking up to people I'd never met at an airport and being like, hi R's parents. Yeah, no, it was real nice to meet you, man. Yeah, I'm gonna go sit down for a second, but hey, it's great to see you. Yeah, great getting to know you. Your son, he's a cool guy. He's chill, real chill. I'm gonna go. At that point, I said goodbye to the group because they were still going onto the beach to do whatever. And I put my last $10 on my LA Metro tap card, basically a public transit pass, and I took the bus to the Green Line train, what's now called the C Line, and took that as far towards Whittier as possible. Unfortunately, the line ended at the Willowbrook Rosa Parks station due to construction, so I was dropped off at the edge of Watts. For those of you unfamiliar with LA, this was not the safest place in LA County, especially back in 2012. Remember how in the beginning I mentioned I was wearing red? Well, I was still wearing that red shirt, and I did not want to be seen wearing gang colors in a place famous for being the most dangerous of the LA Metro stations. I weighed my options. Keep in mind that this was a few years before I'd heard of Uber or Lyft, and I was still high as shit. I saw that my phone was about to run out of battery, so I Google mapped how to get back. It was 15 miles away. I took pictures of different parts of the journey, closed any apps open on my phone, put it in airplane mode and at the lowest backlight setting I could. Then I took my shirt off and stuffed it into a pocket fully so that no hints of color poked out, and started running back to campus shirtless in my shorts. I made it to a main street that made me feel confident that I'd be able to find my way back, so I took one last look at the maps and then I called one of the ALN crew, one of my friends from college. They must have been surprised to hear about what I was doing, but my phone died partway through, so they only got pieces of my situation and weren't able to help me. So I ran as long as I could, but I noticed I was still pretty high and hadn't eaten anything since before we'd left for USC the night before, so almost 16 hours without food at that point, and I was becoming more and more dehydrated in the sun since I couldn't remember drinking any water since the party the night before either. I had no money left, and nothing on me except for about a gram of weed in a plastic bag that Mac D had told me to hold on to back when I was helping him break up weed for a joint, and my dead phone in my pocket. Unfortunately, I had left my debit card at home because they had told me, like, hey man, in case anything happens, like, don't have anything, like if you lose your wallet, you don't want to have all your stuff in there. So I had taken everything out except for like $10. Which I had put on my tap card. Not the best idea in hindsight, but when I was doing it, I was like, oh yeah, it's a party, lots of people, in case there's like a pickpocket there, or there are no pickpockets at parties like that. I've never, at any time in my life, seen someone lose a wallet out of their pants. However, I have seen people get blackout drunk and lose a wallet that way, but I didn't drink, so I didn't really need to worry about that. And, I should have had at least one debit card in my wallet. But unfortunately, I didn't. So as I was running, I felt my pace slowing and my heartbeat pounded in my head, and I slowed down to a walk as I approached a stoplight. At that point, a woman of, let's call it questionable character, in her maybe late 30s or early 40s, approached me asking if I knew where she could get some weed. She was wearing the tallest high heels I'd ever seen in person, a mini skirt, and a tube top with a small purse. I took note of the fact that I was a skinny bearded guy running around shirtless as her reason why she'd asked me, and then I realized that my salvation had come in the form of a call girl looking to get high. So I sold her the gram of weed I had in my pocket for a $10 bill and ran on to the next store I found, the 7-Eleven on Telegraph Road in Santa Fe Springs. One Gatorade and one Freebird burrito from 7-Eleven gave me the energy to make it back to campus, which was only 3 miles away at that point. And I realized that was my second interaction with someone involved in prostitution, the first time being season 3, episode 8. But this hadn't been a negative experience. On the contrary, she'd saved my ass in a way. I made it back to campus around noon, which meant I was probably running somewhere between 12 and 13 minutes per mile, but that's including stopping at stoplights, selling the weed, the stop at 7-Eleven, and being high and dehydrated. So I was a little proud of myself even then. I knocked on a couple doors to let people know I was still alive, then I took a quick shower and went to the CI to get lunch with the ALN crew while I told them the story. Later that night, while messaging Selena and letting her know what had happened, she brought up that you could see the number of messages sent back and forth via Facebook Messenger, and she told me that we'd sent 52,681 messages via Facebook since she left. I posted 52,681 as my Facebook status around 11:30 that night, perhaps as a way to try to prove to myself that I'd tried to put in the work, because Selena had left on September 22nd, 2011, and it was now January 13th, 2013. So she was gone for maybe 476 days, give or take. Subtract at least 5 weeks for the Europe trip, 2 for the Tahoe trip, and maybe she was gone for around 427 days. And by dividing 52,681 by 427, I was able to determine that we sent around 123 messages per day. I can guess that Selena probably sent a few more than I did per day, but even if it wasn't evenly distributed, I thought that still broke down into a lot of consistent communication every day. I already felt like it was tough to keep that amount of communication up, but it just wasn't enough. And I think that number started to convince me that I was going down the wrong path and change would be necessary soon. Especially now that it was basically set in stone that she wouldn't be moving back to the US. I wondered if we'd still be able to finish Carpe Diem if we broke up. But you'll have to tune in next week to see how I managed to shoot a scene for Carpe Diem in Hollywood, California.